Brother Dusty read this morning for us, John 19, 17 through 37. John's account of the crucifixion of Jesus. And John gives probably the shortest version of the gospel writers of the account of Jesus. But then John has details that others don't have. So this morning we're really going to look at being at the foot of the cross and sort of what that's implied for us as believers and sort of some lessons that we can gain from John's account of the gospel. But you know the context. Jesus was beaten to the point of death. I think that we really can't appreciate just how severe the scourging was. I know that some of us have seen movies maybe and pictorial things about what that was like. But Jesus had been beaten. He had been scourged, and scourging itself, some people didn't survive it, and because it was just so brutal. Ripping flesh from bone, and then his face was bruised from the thorns of crown, and I'd say at this point in time, just knowing how the human body works and a little bit about how swelling is, that he was almost unrecognizable from this experience. And then he is compelled to go some great distance from the city to outside the city. The tradition was at the point in time that the condemned would have to carry the crossbar that they would be nailed to the city, and very often they would take the most torturous, difficult route outside the city. So more and more people would witness them, more shame would be thrown upon them. So they make this this journey outside the city. If the other gospel writers account that Jesus was so weakened from my experience, he could not carry the cross, and another person was compelled to carry it for him to the place of crucifixion. It's not comprehensible hardly for us to imagine the physical suffering, but the most difficult was the spiritual suffering. That during this period on the cross, that God would darken the earth for 3 hours, and this was just not some happenstance. But it reflected that God's face was no longer faced toward Christ. That Jesus had never, ever, ever experienced a momentary separation from his Father. It was incomprehensible to him. But he was willing to do that for me and for you because he loved us so much. So Jesus is taken to the point of crucifixion. One of the themes I think that we've sort of seen maybe the past couple of weeks, but we need to make it really, really, really clear that in spite of it all, no matter how it looks to the outsider, no matter how we even want to envision it and how we want to think about it, Jesus is still in control. In fact, one of the gospel writers would say that Jesus will say eventually that on the cross, into thy hands I commend my spirit. That Jesus was in control up to the last moments of his life. That was within his ability, as it was said, he could have called down legions of angels to release him from his suffering. But he made the decision, the willful decision, to remain on the cross for you and for me. He was in control on the cross. As we had read 2-3 times in previous lessons, John chapter 10, Jesus says, I lay down my life that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down myself. I have the power to lay it down and the power to take it up. But he says, this command I received from my Father. So Jesus is in control on the cross. Last Sunday evening we looked at Pilate. And even in the face of this Roman ruler, Jesus is in control. And Pilate sort of recognized it because Jesus says, listen, my kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my people would fight. He said, but it's not in this world. It's a spiritual kingdom. So when Pilate had to write that accusation as to what Jesus is being convicted of, he wrote the thing that incensed the Jews the most. He said, this is the king of the Jews. That was the only thing that Jesus could be accused of. No crime against Rome. But Jesus is professing his kingship over his kingdom. Sort of 4th of July is a celebration of freedom. 4th of July weekend, we celebrate since 1776, and it's been very important for us to sort of recognize that we have become somewhat of an autonomous country, and we have certain freedoms and liberties that we have. And so when we look at that and we recognize freedom, but really when you think of the scene of the cross, you don't think of it in this way, but Jesus was the freest person there. He was free from sin. Now, He took on our sin, but He had no personal sin. He had no crime in which they convict Him. He had no wrongness in His life. He was completely free from sin, but He took on our sin. He became our sin for us. Yet, He was the freest person there in many respects. That on the cross of Calvary, He hung between heaven and earth because of His love for you and for me. Jesus indeed was the freest person at the scene of Calvary. Paul said in Galatians chapter 6, verse 14, he said, "But that God forbid that I should boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by whom the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world." Paul said the cross becomes a very important thing in my history and who I am. And he says, I'm not going to brag in any of my personal accomplishments. I'm not going to acknowledge anything that I have accomplished in this life except for this one thing. I'm going to boast in the cross and what it represents to me. That on this cross that Jesus was crucified the world, and I now, as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus Christ, I now have been crucified to the world. It no longer has any relevance to me. I'm now in the kingdom of Christ, not in the kingdom of this world. As Christians, we live in the shadow of the cross. It's the one thing that we live in the shadow of the cross. Everything in your life should be defined about who you are in your relationship with Christ Jesus. Now, there's a lot of things in this world that distract us. I mean, we would all like to be considered to be the cool kid at school, or the most athletic, or the smartest, or the brightest, or the prettiest. There's a lot of these things. We would like to be successful. We would like to all these things in this world that comes with sort of living in this world. But I tell you what, as a Christian, your most important accomplishment is that. You're in the shadow of the cross. Nothing in this life compares to this. No level of popularity, no success, no money in your bank account. Nothing compares to the importance of being a Christian and living in the shadow of the cross. Nothing! All the people that you may look at that you sometimes envy, think, well, man, I wish I had it like them, or I wish I could be successful like them, or I wish I could have the stuff that they've got, or I wish I could just have that popular. Nothing compares to that. So for the life of the believer, we live in the shadow of the cross. And by the cross, we make everything in our life orient. It becomes our true north. It becomes our point of decision. Whether to do or not to do, based upon whether or not I bring glory to Christ or not glory to Christ, based upon His sacrifice for me on the cross. It becomes the part in which we orient ourselves. Paul said to the church at Corinth, he says, some people think the cross is foolishness. The message of the cross is foolishness. He said, these people are perishing. If they can't get the cross, if they don't understand the cross, when Jesus said in John chapter 14, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. He was looking toward the cross. If you're not willing to accept the cross of Jesus and live in the shadow of the cross, then you're perishing. It's foolishness to you. He said, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. Paul will say in Romans, and while we were still yet sinners, Christ died for us. The cross becomes the central point of us orienting ourselves in this disorienting world. The cross becomes a symbol. the cross becomes an identity. And the challenge we have as believers is to live in the shadow of the cross, to keep putting ourselves in the shadow of the cross in which we orient all of our lives to it. I came across this quote. It was unattributed. I don't know who said it, but I really like it. I stay in the shadow of the old rugged cross because it's the only place where I can see from a heavenly point of view. Man, I'll tell you what, this world gets really messed up at times. And it gets, what's up is down and what's down is up, and it gets really scary at times. And it's not too great a place sometimes as a Christian to want to even be in. But this person is right. When I can get to the vantage point of the cross, when I can view the world from the cross, I begin to make sense of this world. As we talked about last week, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. That Pilate, your kingdom is this world. And this world is a rotting, dying, stinking place to be sometimes. But from the vantage point of the cross, I can see the world for what it is. And so I must cling to the old rugged cross because it is my way of orienting myself in this broken world. It's amazing in how the world will take symbols that are meant to be good and turn them into symbols that mean something quite a bit different. You know, when God destroyed the earth the first time with water, He put a symbol in the sky to promise the world that He would not destroy it again by water. And that was a rainbow. That was a godly, righteous symbol. And now what has the world done with that symbol today? To make a profane affront to Christians. It's offensive to me. You want to talk about offensive? That is offensive to me. That is offensive to me. Because you've taken something that God gave as a promise to man and made it a profane symbol of something that was never meant to be. That angers me. That offends my conscience and sensitivities. And as Christians, if we don't begin to embrace and revere and elevate the cross, and we begin to treat it as something common, guess what? Someone's going to take it and do something else with it as well. We must cling to the cross because that's where we get a heavenly point of view. Three points, and the lesson be yours. From the foot of the cross, I learned, one, that some people only want Jesus from what they can get out of Him. John doesn't say 4, but he said each of the men there, we believe there were 4 soldiers that were sort of this quatrain that sort of led Jesus to the cross. That was sort of how it was done, and that's sort of how it was believed to have been done. Typical Jewish man at that point in time would have 5 articles of clothing. You know, he would have had a pair of sandals. He would have had an outer cloak. He would have had a girth type belt type thing he'd tie around his waist, and he would have a turban, some kind of head covering, and he would have a tunic. So when John says they each divided amongst themselves, each a piece, then they got down to the tunic, so that would have been 4, then the 5th. They said, let's not cut it up because it was such an unusual piece of garment because it was woven whole. Now, some of you who came in, some of you who knit, something like that would appreciate what that meant, but there were no seams in it. It was quite an accomplished piece of handicraft to have had a garment without seams in it. And so that's too valuable. And so really what they wanted from Jesus is just what they could get from Him. He was just another convicted criminal to them. I mean, they saw no glory in Him, that they saw no majesty in Him. Not at this point. Later, the centurion will say, this man must really have been the Son of God. I mean, he'll make a comment to that effect. But not at this point. They just wanted what they could get out of Him. And there's a lot of people who want to be Christians because they want what they can get out of it. Jesus experiences this even in his life. I mean, he saw that people just really sometimes wanted. Remember in John chapter 6 when he fed the multitudes. They came to him for bread. And in fact, in John chapter 6, they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. In other words, Jesus, we like this bread stuff. Just continue to give it to us. And Jesus says, no, it doesn't work that way. Only the people eat my flesh and drink my blood are worthy of the kingdom. And they said, wait a minute, that you can't give us your flesh to eat. They're not understanding his symbolic representation of the bread and cup of the communion. And so from that point on, John says, they begin to walk away from him. And then Jesus asked the 12, he says, do you want to go away as well? Then this great inspiration there that in verse 67, don't have it up on the text, but Jesus, Peter says, but Lord, who else can we go? Because you only have the words of life. Second point. From the foot of the cross, I can learn a disciple of Jesus can be given a lifetime duty. As I was reading the text and studying it the other day, I really began to sort of focus in on an event that happens there on the cross. That John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was there at the foot of the cross. It appears there were 4 women there at the foot of the cross. There was Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's Cleophas, which we don't have a lot of information about. We don't have a lot of... And then there's Mary Magdalene, and then his sister, Mary's sister, his mother's sister. Now, when we go back and look at other texts, that she's identified as the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So I'd never before really made the connection, but other women at the cross is John and James's mother, the sons of Zebedee, with Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Cleophas, which we don't know a lot about. But what's really interesting here that Jesus is there, and he says to her, woman, behold your son, and to the disciple he says, behold your mother. And from that day forward, he took her to his own home, and tradition says that she lived two different versions. She either died in his house in Jerusalem, or she died with him. She died while he was in exile in Ephesus. There was 2 different traditions of her death. But nevertheless, from that point forward, he lived up to what Jesus had called him to do. He was a disciple who was given a lifetime duty. It's a little maybe ironic that his own mother is there as well, so she's hearing this, so she becomes part of the household maybe as well. But John fulfilled this responsibility. And as I reflected on this and looking from what we can learn from the foot of the cross, I have in my life seen and witnessed Christians who had similar type of lifetime duties. Some of you are doing that now. You're caring for aging parents. Some of you may be caring for a spouse that's sick, a child with special needs. That you're fulfilling a lifetime duty because of who you are in Christ. I grew up in a church where one of the men had served as elder, and a former elder, that their daughter was born with severe mental disabilities. And from birth, they said she wouldn't live to be a teenager. She got to be a teenager. They said she wouldn't live to be an adult. And then she got to be an adult, and they said she wouldn't live much longer. She's now over 60 years old. And he and his wife are still caring for her in their home. She has maybe the capacity of a 2-year-old child. She can't communicate. She can't even call out their name. They must dress her. They must feed her. And they still care for her. They've committed their entire life to a Christian duty. And I'm just saying this morning, if you feel sometimes overwhelmed and overburdened by the duties that you're living up to honor someone, that started from the cross. that started from Jesus saying, we have responsibilities for one another in the kingdom. And sometimes, as preachers, we can sometimes lay guilt trips on people saying what you ought to do, what you should be doing, and something like that. But you need to recognize that that in itself is a ministry. That's a call from God to do that. And we don't know where we're going to find ourselves in that situation in life. And we don't know how that's going to unfold in our lives. And I witnessed with my own mother, just saw how she took in her parents and other relative, and she cared for them to their death, and she raised 5 kids, and she did much of this by herself. And when she got finished with that, she became a foster parent, and how she's cared for people basically her entire life. And seeing her as an example in doing that is that sometimes God calls us to do those kind of duties. And that's part of the kingdom. And we in the kingdom must, as much as we can, help people doing that, encourage people to do that, support them, and make it as easy as possible task for them in doing that. But I think this is a lesson we can learn from the foot of the cross, that some Christians have ministries and duties sometimes thrust upon them. Just this week, I was talking to someone and referencing Winston Churchill, and I think the quote he said is that something to this effect, that some men aspire from greatness and some people have greatness thrust upon them. And I think there's some people that sometimes have these duties sort of thrust upon them, and we look at them, we see them do their duties, and we think we're humbled by that because we see Christ-like compassion in them. Lastly, and these are not all the things we can learn from the cross, but these are 3 I focused on this morning. From the foot of the cross, I learned that Jesus finished His mission in its entirety. Nothing else is needed. Now that may seem like a real simple thing, because we're going to see in the text that Jesus clearly says, it is finished. Verse 30, He says, it is finished. And bowing His head, He gave up His spirit. Now listen to the text. Who's in control here? He gave up His spirit. Jesus is in control. Remember that. When your life seems out of control, remember what? Jesus is in control. Okay? He gave up His spirit, but He said, it is finished. Now that is a theological, doctrinal statement that man just not seem to get. And when Jesus says it is finished, it isn't finished. There's a lot of man-made stuff out there. There are man-made religions and doctrines that proclaim that Jesus really, His mission wasn't quite completed. But what we understand from the cross is that Jesus, it's finished. That means I don't need another prophet. I don't need someone to come behind me and say, oh no, here's the rest of the story. I don't need another revelation. I don't need some Johnny come later that says, oh no, follow this, follow my teachings. It's the true teachings of Jesus. But Jesus, it is finished, period. It's over. He completed His Father's mission. There's even some strange doctrines out there. They've been out there for a while that said that Jesus really got defeated. And so He didn't get to establish the earthly kingdom He wanted to establish, because He's going to come back and do that later. So He gave the church as a consolation prize to sort of hold us over till the earthly kingdom gets established. Folks, there's no Bible in that. That's some fancy imaginations of some theologian somewhere. When Jesus says, it is finished, it is finished. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the end, the first and the last, the firstborn over all creation. There's no Johnny-come-latelys can change that. From the foot of the cross, I understand that Jesus truly is it. So to sort of bring things to an end this morning is sort of back where we started. From the foot of the cross, I really do understand that I need to cling to the cross. Because this world is really disorienting. You know, I have on my phone, I don't use it very often. Probably would not get lost if I would. But I have a feature that's a compass. Okay? And I can call the compass up, and it will always point to true north. So if I got lost woods or lost drive or something like that, and if I'm going north or south, I can take my phone out and turn the app on, and it will point to true north. You see, the cross for the Christian becomes the same thing in our life. When we go back to the cross and we orient our life and our decisions and our will and our culture and our families and our vocation, when we orient everything back to the cross, it begins to make sense. I'm no longer lost. Once heard a preacher story of a little boy in a large city. Also in this large city was a very large church, and they had a huge cross outside the church. And a man found this little boy sort of sobbing on the street corner, and he says, "Well, son," he said, "what's wrong?" He says, "I'm lost." And the man says, "Well, son, where do you live?" He says, "Well, I don't know." And he says, "Well, what neighborhood?" He says, "Well, I don't know." He said, "I'm lost," and something like that. But the boy says that he said, "Mister," he says, "there's a church in my neighborhood that has a big cross in the front yard. If you get me to the cross, I can find my way home from there." A wise little boy. If you can get me to the cross, I can find my way from there. So as Christians, we need to learn to live in the shadow of the cross. It's not a burden. It's a way of being oriented to this world. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, we encourage you to become one. There's nothing that we're going to do to hinder you. You confess He's your Savior, be buried with Him in baptism, and we're going to rejoice with you. If you're here this morning, perhaps you need a prayer on your behalf. If you're subject, won't you come as we stand and sing a song like that?